Mr. Nehring, sitting here today, do you have a clear recollection of where you were, or where the conversation between Mark Jensen and Ed Klug occurred?
Objection. He doesn't have any idea if or where a conversation took place. He can say what Mr. Klug supposedly told him. The question was, does he know where the conversation took
I'll
place?
rephrase it. Okay, sitting here today, Mr. Nehring, do you have a clear recollection of what Mr. Klug told you about where his conversation with Mark Jensen occurred, where ways to kill your wife was discussed?
Yes.
And as you're sitting here today, what is your recollection about what Mr. Klug told you about where this conversation with Mark Jensen occurred?
It took place in St. Louis.
Now, do you recall Mr. Albee asking you a question about your testimony on August 29th of 2007, where you indicated that the conversation between you and Mr. Klug occurred in Appleton?
Yes, I do.
And you concede that that answer was given.
You've got a leading question afoot here. Start over.
Okay. Did you answer that question that the conversation occurred in Appleton?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And were you mistaken then?
Yes, I was. You called me shortly thereafter and told me that you would send me a copy of the transcript, as there were several inconsistencies that you noted within it from things I had said previously. And that transcript was dated September 27th, so you probably talked to me a couple of weeks before that. And I asked you what they were, and you mentioned that I had said that the
Objection to the hearsay of saying anything Ms. Gabrielle had to say.
Well, it doesn't sound like it's being offered to prove the truth of the matter, certainly.
Well, I think if the content of the conversation is being introduced, that is the purpose. If he just says, I spoke with you and then therefore I did X, that's appropriate.
Mr. Nehring, you had an opportunity to review that transcript, is what you just said?
That's correct.
And what was your purpose in reviewing the transcript?
To look for misstatements.
And did you find any misstatements?
Yes, two.
And what misstatements did you find?
That I had talked about Appleton instead of St. Louis. And also that on December 3rd, I had stated I hadn't talked to Mark, where we had written notes that I gave to the district attorney that said I talked to him 3 times on December 3rd.
Now, as you're sitting here today, is there any doubt in your mind as to
What's the objection?
The supposed certainty of his recollection, he's just sworn to tell the truth. That's
Well, I
what
agree, but
remembers.
I agree. But I still think it adds a feature that the jury can properly consider the objections overruled.
Now, as you're sitting here today, is there any doubt in your mind as to what Ed Klug told you about where the conversation occurred between he and Mark Jensen?
No.
Do you recall whether you were at the Blueprint Conference in St. Louis in November of 1998?
Yes, I was.
And at the time that Mr. Klug disclosed to you that his conversation with Mark Jensen occurred at the Blueprint in St. Louis in November of 1998, did you recall then that you had been at that conference?
Yes.
And directing your attention to the conversation between you and Mr. Klug in Boston, as you're sitting here today, do you recall whether you intended to seek out Mr. Klug at that conference?
Yes, I did.
And why?
Objection asked and answered.
No.
I think actually not. The objection's overruled.
So, Mr. Nehring, why did you want to seek out Mr. Klug?
I had heard that he had made that statement, and I wanted to hear him say it.
What statement?
that Mark Jensen told him he was going to kill his wife.
And why did you want to know this?
Objection, irrelevant.
It doesn't strike me as being relevant.
It's relevant because it goes to why he would have paid attention to exactly what Mr. Klug was telling him. At that point,
Speaking of,
Well, but I asked for it, though. Just Mr. Jambois. The objection's overruled.
Why did I want to know that?
Yes.
Well, I'd known Mark and Julie, for a long time, and I'd worked with Mark, and I was emotionally, involved in the whole affair.
when you say affair, what do you mean?
Bad choice of words. The whole, what the trial is all about.
And were you intending to pass that information on to law enforcement?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Albee asked you a series of questions about the description Mr. Jensen gave you regarding Mr. Jensen wanting Mrs. Jensen to go to the doctor. Do you remember that exchange?
Yes.
And you indicated that you thought it was for her physical health.
That's correct.
And why did you think that?
Even though all of the issues that Mr. Albee raised were relevant, it was our discussion, the discussion between Mark and myself, were always about seeking physical help, not mental help.
Now, Mr. Albee also asked you that it was because of Mr. Jensen's expressed concerns about Julie Jensen's condition that you had your wife call Julie Jensen. You remember that?
Yes.
Was there any other reason that you asked your wife to call Mrs. Jensen?
I object to the relevance.
Overruled.
No.
Mr. Albee also asked you about internet searches that Mr. Jensen conducted after Mrs. Jensen's death, correct?
Yes.
Do you clearly remember, as you're sitting here today, Mr. Jensen conducting internet searches on drug interactions prior to Mrs. Jensen's death?
Yes.
And why do you remember that so clearly?
Because it happened on a very frequent basis.
Could you see that these internet searches were for drug interactions, or was that just what Mr. Jensen was telling you?
That's what Mark told me.
Now, Mr. Albee also referred you to an answer from your transcript where you said you were still friendly with Mr. Jensen after Mrs. Jensen's death. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you hesitated a little bit in answering the original question. Can you explain that?
Friendly simply sounded a little too friendly. I tried to tone it down a little bit. We worked together. I was cordial, but friendly didn't seem like exactly the right word at this time.
And had you been friendly with him prior to Mrs. Jensen's death?
Yes.
And what caused the change in your relationship?
objection, relevant.
What's the relevance?
Well, Mr. Albee asked the question. I'm just getting clarification.
Well, the question dealt before with whether there was, what the state of their relationship was. Now you're asking the why. The state of the relationship may be relevant. I'm not sure that the reason is. And in fact, I think the answer, actually, when I think about it, I think you did inquire about this on your cross.
I don't think I asked him why.
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
It's a
Close
dangerous.
enough. Close enough. Go ahead and answer.
Please repeat the question.
What caused the change, or why did your relationship change from friendly to cordial?
I was just uncomfortable with the entire situation.
What situation?
The events that took place leading up to her death and the fact that she did pass.
What events leading up to her death?
The affair that Mark had with Kelly Labonte, the way he described Julie's health, and the way my wife described Julie's health, the searching for drug interactions. I was just very uncomfortable with all of that.
Now, Mr. Albee pointed out that on August 29th of 2007, when you previously testified, that you indicated that Mr. Jensen had come to work on December 3rd. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And today you answered that Mr. Jensen did not come to work. Do you remember that?
Yes, that's correct.
And do you have a clear recollection as to which one it was?
I do. It was that he did not come in.
Okay. And do you recall giving a statement, a written statement to Detective Ratsberg in March of 2002?
Yes.
And do you recall telling Detective Ratsberg that Mark did call in on December 3rd and stated he would be in late or not at all?
Yes, I do.
And your memory on that date was better than,
Objection.
well, I withdraw that. Do you recall testifying on August 29th of 2007 at a prior hearing?
Yes.
And I'll direct counsel's attention to page 19, line 7 through 16. Do you recall this exchange when you were questioned by myself? On December 3rd of 1998, did you see Mr. Jensen that day? Answer, was that the day she died? Question, yes. No, I did not see him. Question, were you at work that day? Answer, yes. Question, did Mr. Jensen come to work that day? Answer, no. Question, did you speak to him? Yes. And how did you speak to him? Answer, he called to let me know that Julie had died. You recall that?
Yes.
Can you explain why on the direct examination you answered that you did not see him, and then on the cross-examination you said that you had?
Yeah, under the pressure of the proceedings, I had December 3rd and December 4th crossed up, and at that time, things were not clear in my mind at all.
Okay. Are you clear as you sit here today as to whether you saw Mr. Jensen on the day Julie Jensen died?
Yes, I am.
And did you see him?
I did not.
Now, Mr. Albee asked you whether you knew if there was any truth to what Detective Ratzberg was saying to Mr. Jensen during their interview. Do you remember that exchange?
Yes, I do.
Did you know whether there was any truth to what Mr. Jensen was telling you?
No, I did not.
And in fact, was his description of Ms. Jensen's condition and personality different from what you knew of her?
Objection, he has no personal knowledge. He testified he hadn't seen her.
The objection is sustained.
Now, Mr. Albee asked you about Mr. Jensen's computer that was sent to St. Louis. And you testified that Mr. Jensen's computer, or that Mr. Jensen claimed his computer was fried. You remember that?
Yes.
Prior to that conversation with Mr. Jensen, had you had any experience with anyone else's computer in the office being fried?
Objection to relevance.
No.
And since that date, have you had any experience with any computer in your office being fried?
No.
And Mr. Albee asked you questions about audits that the Home Office could do and about system checks that the Home Office could do on your computers, correct?
Yes.
Did that ever happen to your knowledge in your office?
You mean a system check on computers? Mm-hmm. A system check by the Home Office?
Yes.
They routinely monitor various things.
As of this conversation that you had with Mr. Jensen, where suddenly the next Monday his computer was fried, at that point, were you aware of any system checks where internet history would be checked?
No, not specifically.
And did Mr. Jensen ever say that he knew of that happening?
No.
Oh, never mind.
Now, Mr. Albee asked you questions about Mr. Jensen's contact with Ms. Labonte when he would go to St. Louis. Would Mr. Jensen sometimes fly to St. Louis?
I believe so.
Would he meet Ms. Labonte in places other than St. Louis?
I don't know.
Now, Mr. Albee asked you about a baseball game that Mr. Jensen went to in St. Louis with Dan Exner. Do you know whether Mr. Jensen saw Ms. Labonte on that day as well as going to the baseball game?
No, I don't.
And do you know whether, in fact, he went to the baseball game with Mr. Exner?
Yes, that rang true.
Okay. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Any request?
Mr. Nehring, on August 29th, 2007, when you testified, you raised your right hand and took an oath to tell the truth, right?
Yes, I did.
And you testified that Mr. Klug told you that this alleged conversation took place in Appleton, right?
Objection, asked and answered.
It's foundation, Judge.
Go ahead.
Yes, I did.
And then you took an oath today and raised your hand to tell the truth, and now you're saying something different, right?
That's correct.
And today you say you had a clear recollection, right?
That's correct.
You didn't say that you had any uncertainty in your recollection when you swore to tell the truth back in August, right?
That's correct.
You didn't say that you had any uncertainty about seeing Mr. Jensen on December 3rd at your office at that time, right?
That's correct.
You didn't say you were feeling pressured, right?
No, I did not.
You didn't ask for any clarification, right?
That's correct.
You weren't confused when you said that, right?
I stated I think I was between the dates.
Now, Ms. Gabrielle read back some testimony to you in which you had stated that you didn't see him on December 3rd on direct examination, correct?
That's correct.
And then do you recall clarifying later on in direct examination, before the cross-examination, before the pressure of cross-examination, at page 26, beginning at line 21, where you clarified that you'd been mixing up the dates during direct examination?
Yes, I do.
And on direct examination, on your own, you volunteered that you'd set the record straight and clarify the dates, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And what you said at page 26, line 21, you volunteered at the end of the direct examination. Can I add one thing? I think when you asked me about the dates and the time that Mark called me following Julie's death, and I guess you kept asking me if it was the 3rd, and I think it was the day after Julie died, we talked in the morning. The dates kind of all run together, correct?
Yes.
And it's because you decided that the dates had all blurred and run together and you were mixing up the 3rd and the 4th that you testified in cross-examination that you did in fact see Mark Jensen in his office on December 3rd, true?
Yes.
And that was under oath, right?
Yes.
And can you tell me, and you had a clear recollection of that at the time, right?
I stated that I did, yes.
Right. And can you tell us today what things you have a clear recollection of that upon going home and reflecting later on, you'll realize you were wrong about?
No, I can't.
Now, your recollection remains that Mr. Klug told you that other people were there during this conversation, right?
That he had with Mark?
Yes.
Yeah, my recollection is that Ed implied there were other people that would have heard that.
And so that hasn't changed.
It's as I stated it, that's correct.
And it was only after meeting with the prosecutor and being informed that your testimony was inconsistent with the other information they had that you've changed your testimony, right?
No. I've met with them and I have changed my testimony, but when the assistant DA called and said there were inconsistencies and I asked what they were, and she stated that you said Ed talked to Mark in Appleton, I kind of said I did. So that's really when I realized back then that I had misstated that.
And you had heard what Mr. Klug had testified to, right? You had heard Mr. Klug had testified to being in St. Louis with Mark when the conversation took place, right?
I didn't listen to Ed Klug's testimony.
Well, you read about it in the paper, right?
Certainly, yes, I did.
And you talked to Mr. Klug right after he testified, right?
Briefly, yes.
And you talked to Mr. Klug after you testified, right?
That's correct.
And you realized that there was, when you talked to him after you testified, you realized that there was a problem there between your two stories, right?
No, I didn't realize there was a problem until the assistant DA called me.
Now, you recall on redirect examination testifying that your memory had been refreshed by the written statement that you had read, right?
Please repeat that.
Sure. You testified on redirect examination that your memory had been refreshed by a written statement that you had reviewed, right? You recall that?
Are you talking about this earlier today?
Yes.
That's not exactly what I said. I said it might have, you asked me a question that was kind of a surprise to me, and I was kind of grasping for when and where did I reconcile this. And so at the time I said, I think it might have been, and in fact it was something in writing. It was the written transcript that they sent to me.
I didn't ask you any questions. These questions were from Ms. Gabrielle.
No,
No,
Your Honor, that's not
I have to agree with the
true.
witness.
Because the court allowed me to, I moved for production of the statement. It was during
Well,
Ms.
you're
Gabrielle.
right, you're right, you're right.
Ms. Gabrielle asked you the question when you said, I reviewed the notes or written statement or something.
Oh, that's correct. That's correct.
Now, Mr. Jensen had told you not only about Julie's depression in November 1998, but he was also telling you he was concerned because of her history of depression, right?
Those things were mentioned, yes.
He told you that she had been in counseling several years earlier, right?
I don't remember that specifically.
He told you that she had been on antidepressants several years earlier, right?
We may have talked about the antidepressants, yes.
And does that refresh your recollection that Mr. Jensen wanted his wife to go to the doctor because of depression so that maybe she could consider whether antidepressants were warranted?
No, it doesn't. We talked about Julie's health a great deal and her failing health a great deal, and Mark wanted her to get medical attention. But my recollection isn't that it was mental attention, it was strictly medical attention.
So it's not your recollection that it was mental attention despite the fact that he was talking about her being withdrawn, that he was talking about her losing weight, that he was talking about her crying, that he was talking about her being miserable, that he was talking about
Objection, Your
her
Honor,
not...
this is argumentative.
I think it's a proper cross-examination overruled.
That's correct.
That he was talking about her mother's history of depression, that she was talking about she didn't want to be hospitalized for mental illness, and that she had been on antidepressants before. Despite all that, you thought that the only reason for going to the doctor was because she wasn't feeling well.
You're isolating those events. We had a lot of discussions, and I stand by I felt Mark wanted her to get medical attention, not mental attention.
So those 8 to 10 events I just identified were isolated?
You're isolating them from all the other items that we talked about. That's correct.
Now, the drug interaction you mentioned, you're unable to say what drugs were involved? You don't recall?
That was never talked about.
So, you're saying he didn't tell you what drugs he was concerned about?
That's correct.
And so you don't know whether it was a concern about overconsumption of Tylenol or aspirin?
That's correct.
Now, you were asked some questions about whether anybody else has had any, well, I guess the term was fried computers at your office place, right?
That's correct.
People have computer problems at Stiefel or not? Where you work?
I'm not familiar with any.
So your testimony is now in 9 years, nobody there has had a computer problem.
Well, Your Honor, I'm going to object to the vagueness of the question.
I don't think anything vague about it at all.
Well, what kind of computer
Following up on
problem?
an answer that the witness gave, and he's asking him to make a statement on it. That's not vague at all. Overruled.
I'm not aware of any others being sent back for malfunction.
I'd like the name of your IT person before you go, but that's all I have.
Any question?
Nothing further.
You may step down, sir.
Thank you. May I follow the trial? Or am I
Beg pardon?
May I follow the trial from here forward, or am I still sequestered?
I think I would rather you just kept as you've been.
Thank you.
Thank you.